What have I told you? You're being lied to about Scotland's urban geography, its human geography, how we live as a society on a daily basis by people paid very substantial sums of money to tell us what's going on in our country, and that in fact our country bears more of a resemblance to Austria than it does to the picture that we're being shown on our TVs, radios and in our newspapers. Hello and welcome to this edition of Scottish Tenants News, where I'm going to be talking lyrically about my own experiences in housing and also how they differ from what we're told is the norm. This is the housing scheme where I grew up, Craigiebank. It's Homes for Heroes housing around here. So a lot of the housing was built between the World Wars, made of metal construction, and since then a lot of people have bought their houses and done various things to them, but the homes here were built for the heroes of the First World War, and very nice place to grow up. Lots and lots of old gaines that line the streets, and good views of Fife, easy access. The schools around here were good. We had a playground just over there, over the road, and in the centre, the building that kind of defines the scheme is a big kirk. I'll pop over there and let you see. So this is the building that defines the scheme, Craigiebank Kirk, and it sits in the middle of an eye, this circle here. The planners asked the new heroes, the tenants, the first houses here, whether they wanted a mechanics institute and a kirk, and the people, obviously much more religious in today I think, said no, the kirk will do both jobs fine. So that's the defining building, but as you can see it's kind of an interesting modernist building. I'm standing here in Douglas today, a scheme where my father's from, in the street where my gran and granda had a house. My brother stays in this scheme today, and yeah, it's a very nice place. There's lots of green space. It was a great place to go as a bairn, to spend time with my gran and granda. So yeah, this is Douglas, big scheme in the east end of Dundee. My first proper flat when I moved to Glasgow, or Maryhill in fact, was here in Cedar Court, and I stayed in that middle block there, number 65. A fine flat, family sized house on the 17th and 18th floor, and that was where I caught the Tenants Association bug. The council at the time were in cahoots with the GHA, who were the landlords then, trying to pull the place down to make way for a tower block and a multi-storey development called New Dundas Wharf and New Rotterdam Wharf, which we finally defeated at a public local inquiry. Yeah, Cedar Court, during COP26, a lot of the delegates were brought here because it recently won an architectural award for a passive house redesign. So these homes are now, almost without a need for heating. So in the mid-noughties we fought to save the scheme. And this is where I stay now, the Wineford in Maryhill. Local people call it the Barracks because it was the base for the Highland Light Infantry, the Bantams, and the wall that surrounds the scheme has been retained. It's a listed monument, and the gatehouse there was the old gatehouse for the Highland Light Infantry. So local people call it the Barracks. The scheme was designed by a man called Harold Buteau, a pacifist architect who worked for the Scottish Special Housing Association. It won awards at the time, and to be fair to Buto, he did a good job. His idea was that there would be courtyard living. So behind us we see what we call the cricket pitch, because although no one plays cricket there today, that was the cricket grounds for the Highland Light Infantry. And as you can see, there's people having a picnic. Pretty much every area in the scheme has a little square, somewhere where you can have a barbecue, speak to your friends. It leads to a very pleasant style of living. Maryhill, where the Wynford and Cedar Court are located, is a working class town that became absorbed by Glasgow City, and it's dominated by this road here, the A81. And I don't know if you see just in the background there, big sign, that's the entrance to East Dunbartonshire, the gerrymandered council that Bearsden, a community of full employment, one of those rare things in Scotland, is based. Now, I'm not here to knock Scotland's lack of an integrated public transport system, or to decry people who live in out-of-town suburbs like Bearsden, where I am just now, or even the fact that they refer to my community as the Maryhill corridor, or worse, Scary Hill. My point's this: this style of living, which is much more commonplace in the USA, they call it the Barbs there, I think, where people have a detached home, a driveway, 1, 2, 3 cars. That's not the Scottish norm. Over 50% of Scotland stays in a housing scheme. But if you were to watch the BBC, STV, pick up a newspaper, listen to the radio, this here would be reflected as the norm. Now, it's fair to say that civic life in streets like this is pretty low compared with the almost incidental civic life that you have in schemes like the one I've just been in. So why is this important? Well, the point is this: representation matters. Every nation is what they call an imagined community, and those ideas that we have of ourselves impact things like the culture, the political discourse, what we perceive as possible, what we perceive as desirable. In my community, for example, the 26-storey towers, 4 of them, hundreds of tons of embodied carbon in structures that will last hundreds of years, are being pulled down in an act of monstrous political, cultural and environmental vandalism. Probably a crooked real estate deal, who can say? We're fighting it. But the point is this: when you're told that the norm is something that's actually quite unusual, that colours people's attitudes. It also colours the attitudes of decision makers. When the only representation of over 50% of the people of your country is in prurient reality TV shows like The Scheme, or on reruns of Taggart, this is a real problem for our society. It also raises real questions about how our cultural institutions are managed. How did we get to a state where a quite unusual form of living is seen as the Scottish norm in our television, our radio, all broadcast media? The late great Alistair Gray wrote an inflammatory, it must be said, essay entitled Settlers and Colonists. And what he was talking about, albeit as a provocateur, was that many of our cultural institutions, and I think if I remember correctly, he was talking about Scottish ballet at the time, I may be wrong, maybe some other institution, were dominated by an elite group of upper middle class professionals, most of whom were educated and lived in England. And that in institutions like the BBC, it's obvious to see how that could arise. They have a headquarters and are a somewhat centralised organisation. But it's also reflected in a range of other cultural institutions. And this is a significant problem for us, because our physical, spatial, urban geography, our human geography, is very, very different from England. In England, there are entire councils where less than 5% of all of the housing is some form of public housing. In Scotland, as I say, over 50% of us stay in a housing scheme. Now, there have been a whole range of really unhelpful Thatcherite or neoliberal, if you like, measures which have drastically impacted on how our people live. Obviously, everyone would mention right to buy, but I would like to talk about Gordon Brown's housing needs policy, which stipulated that the whole of the United Kingdom, every council in the United Kingdom, if it was looking for money from, in England, what was then the HCA, but in Scotland, the devolved administration followed the same pattern, they had to move towards the perfect amount of social housing, which was 5%. And it was set by some inner London borough, some wealthy London borough. So Glasgow, where just about 70-80% of all the homes that were constructed comprising public housing or former public housing, if they were to acquire any of that central government grant money, they had to pull houses down. So the GHA, which inherited another of the right-wing policies, the stock transfer, the GHA, which inherited the 85,000 public homes, they tore down half of them. But nevertheless, we're still left with a position where, if we look at our housing, our urban geography, our human geography, we're more like Vienna than we are like Kensington and Chelsea. We're far more different from that country than is at all reflected in our media. And as I say, politicians, decision makers, these people don't live in a vacuum, and every human mind is a sponge to some degree. If you're being told, the norm is everyone stays in a house with a driveway and a garage and a back and front door, and they've all got picket fences, and the only real matters of contest in those communities are high hedges disputes, that really impacts on how the nation sees itself and the possibilities it can see in its own people. And that's the real problem with this lack of representation.